it becomes extremely scary. It was only when it appeared that the forecasts were false that indeed we were not running in or not likely to run into these large surpluses, and indeed they disappeared. At that point, I reverted to my older position, namely, I was in favor of tax cuts, but only if they are matched by cuts in spending. And I therefore reverted to that position in congressional testimony in 2002 and 2003, in fact, to the point where I recall a number of congressmen asked me, do I understand you correctly? You're saying that you are in favor of the tax cuts, but only if spending is cut. If spending is not cut, were we to read from you that you were not supporting the tax cuts? And I said, that is correct. So Paul Krugman's view that somehow I didn't change my mind until after I got out of office is factually false. And indeed, I did change my mind. I changed my mind in 2002 and 2003 largely because the whole notion of which fundamentally got me in favor of significant tax cuts without offsetting expenditures was a very special event which probably had not occurred in the United States for 150 years, namely the vision of our total federal debt effectively going to zero.
NAOMI KLEIN.
Well, just another piece of the puzzle here that I think is important to remember is that, Alan Greenspan, in your book, you make it clear that you are ideologically very much a supporter of the principle of privatizing Social Security, and in fact were very disappointed that the Bush administration did not pick this up after the elections in 2000. Even though they hadn't campaigned on privatization of Social Security, you felt that they should have pushed this forward. So doesn't creating a shortfall because of tax cuts bolster the case for privatization of Social Security that you have written you are an ideological supporter of?
Well, first of all, ideology is not what I hold. I try to learn what are the facts, and I let my opinions judged on the facts, not by some preconception, which I regret is what ideology as a notion means. First of all, let me just suggest something to you. Social Security, as it now exists, and is now currently funded, will be a very small part of overall retirement income in the years ahead. There is in fact, no alternative as things now stand that a very substantial part of the so-called replacement of income that one talks about when one retires is going to have to come from the private sector. And so no matter what is done with federal Social Security, the average person is going to have to rely ever more increasingly on private sources of income, whether it's private savings or working or whatever. But if you look at the future of Social Security and the demographics we're now dealing with, the extent to which it replaces lost income when you retire is decreasing.
Alan Greenspan, the issue of whether we have enough money in this country, do you think that that also calls into question the war in Iraq, how the U.S. can afford to continue this war?
Well, the issue is basically the question of the commitments of Social Security relative, and Medicare, I might add, relative to the costs of the war. There's no question that a significant amount of money is being wasted in war. That is what happens in war, and that's clearly we're talking hundreds of billions. The issue here is that
I believe the figure's in the trillions.
Even if the war spending were not there, we would have these problems. So it's true that there's a good deal of waste going on, but the problems to which I'm referring to existed before the war and will continue after the war.
The subprime crisis that we are seeing today, many saying that you seriously contributed to this, laid the foundation with keeping the interest rates low.
Well, the subprime crisis did occur as a result of lower interest rates. The lower interest rates, however, are, if one takes a look at the whole context of rising home prices throughout the world, is clearly a global issue. It is the result of fundamental changes that occurred as a consequence of the end of the Cold War, and that housing bubbles appear in more than 24 countries around the world, which screams for an explanation that is global, not individual.
I know that you're going to have to leave soon.
May I just finish?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
We in the United States basically tried to get mortgage interest rates up and slow the bubble. And remember, it's the bubble which created a goodly part of the problem which we've had in the subprime market. And we failed. And that tells us basically that it's the global forces that are at play here. But just taking a step back, I think it would be a terrible mistake if we look at the subprime market and decide it should be eliminated, because I think it's been a very successful market to allow many people in this country to have homes which wouldn't otherwise be able to have them. The subprime market has a lot of technical problems wrong with it, and there are many issues that are involved with financial securitization and like, which created difficulties.
Alan Greenspan.
I hope in the process we don't eliminate the subprime market.
Alan Greenspan, you write in the end of your book, a Federal Reserve system that will be confronted with the challenge of inflation pressures and populist politics that have been relatively quiescent in recent years is something that is very significant. You say the United States in 2030 is likely to be characterized by populist politics that have been relatively quiescent in recent years. How important is populist politics, and what do you envision those to look like?
Well, remember what populist politics is. It's a very special brand of short-term focus, which invariably creates very difficult long-term problems. A goodly part of the book, as you know, is written about how populism has gripped, say, many Latin American countries to their detriment. And the term populist politics is essentially another way of saying short-term versus longer-term. And people who emphasize short-term benefits for long-term costs end up with very little in the way of economic growth and prosperity.
NAOMI KLEIN.
Mr. Greenspan, I'm wondering whether you feel that you share any responsibility in the rise of this economic populism, because of course you took over the Federal Reserve during the Reagan administration, and when Reagan took office, CEOs earned 43 times more than their workers, and when you left the Federal Reserve, they made more than 400 times more than their workers. So the policies that you pursued, deregulation, privatization, free trade, have contributed to this extraordinary division of income that is really the fuel for this economic populism that you're now denouncing. So aren't you the one that has caused this crisis of faith in capitalism, or at least don't you share some of that responsibility?
Well, look, the whole issue of what has happened in this country with respect to the increasing inequality of income is an issue I address and abhor in the book. And I point out that what is causing it, to a very significant extent, is the fact that skilled labor is under extraordinary demand as the technologies increase. And we've had a dysfunctional education system in this country, both in primary and secondary schools, which is showing up in all the studies which indicate that while our children in the 4th grade are doing fairly well relative to international comparisons,